If you've scrolled past this topic recently, you've probably seen the headline already. Grok AI just reanalyzed the Roman Dodecahedron, and the results are terrifying. Cremated human bone residue, spiritual gateways, a forbidden practice the empire tried to quarantine and erase from the record. It's a great hook. It's also completely made up. There was no lab, no forensic report, no AI-run metallurgical study that uncovered a secret cult. What actually happened is that a chatbot was asked to write a dramatic story, and it did exactly what it was asked to do. And then that fictional output got dressed up as breaking science news and copy-pasted across a dozen channels with slightly different titles. Here's the thing, though. You don't need any of that invented material to make this genuinely unsettling, because the real story is already strange enough on its own. A small bronze object, expensive to make, found buried across the northern edge of the Roman Empire, appears in over 100 confirmed examples, and not one Roman ever wrote a single word about what it was for. Not a letter, not an inventory, not a graffito scratched into a wall, nothing. In an empire that documented tax records, military rosters, road distances, and the price of grain down to the last denarius, this one object simply doesn't exist in the written record at all. That's not a manufactured mystery. That's a real archaeological silence, and real silences like that are rare and more interesting than most fake reveals could ever be. It's worth pausing on why the fake version works so well, because it's not an accident. This particular object has been quietly famous in archaeology and history circles for decades, well before any of these videos existed. It shows up in museum collections across Germany, France, Britain, and the Netherlands. It's been the subject of academic papers, blog debates, and at least one viral knitting demonstration, all built on the same honest premise that nobody actually knows what it was for. That existing legitimate mystery is exactly the kind of foundation clickbait creators look for, because half the persuasive work is already done. All they have to add is a villain, a cover-up, and a body count, and suddenly a 200-year-old academic puzzle becomes a horror story. The tragedy is the real puzzle gets buried under the fake one in the process. So let's actually go through what's true, what these objects are, why nobody can agree on their purpose after nearly 300 years of trying, and why the honest version of this mystery is more worth your attention than the fictional AI conspiracy currently flooding your feed. Start with what you're actually looking at. A Roman dodecahedron is a small hollow object, usually cast in bronze, sometimes in other copper alloys, with 12 flat pentagonal faces. Each face has a circular hole cut through its center, and critically, the holes aren't the same size from face to face. Every corner where the pentagons meet is capped with a small spherical knob. The objects range from around 4 to 11 centimeters across, roughly the size of a golf ball, up to a large orange, and they were made using the lost wax casting technique, a process that required real skill and real cost for a Roman metalworker. Some are plain. Many are decorated with rings of small dots or engraved circles around the holes. None of them carry any numbers, letters, or symbols that could function as instructions, measurements, or a key. Whatever they were for, whoever made them assumed you'd already know how to use it just by looking at it, which is either a sign of something so mundane it needed no explanation, or something so specialized only a small circle of people were ever meant to understand it. The first one on record turned up in 1739. Since then, the count has climbed past 130 confirmed finds, and the geography is one of the strangest parts of the whole picture. They show up across Gaul, in what's now France, across Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Britain. That's it. Not one has ever been found in Italy. Not one in the Roman heartland, not near Rome itself, not in the Mediterranean core of the empire at all. Whatever this object was, it belongs specifically to the empire's northern frontier provinces, the borderlands where Roman culture overlapped with Gallic and Germanic populations, and that geographic pattern alone has fueled 100 years of speculation about what exactly it was tied to. Dating puts most known examples somewhere between the 2nd and 4th centuries AD, which places them squarely inside the height of the Roman imperial period, not some marginal, poorly documented era. This wasn't made by a fringe group scraping by outside the reach of the state. It was made during the empire's most administratively organized centuries, in provinces under full Roman control by people who clearly had access to skilled bronze casting. And still, nothing. No mention anywhere. Now, let's go through what serious researchers have actually proposed, because the real list of theories is honestly more entertaining than the fictional occult version, precisely because none of them fully work. And watching each one almost fit and then fall apart is where the actual mystery lives. The oldest and simplest theory is that these were candle holders. Some examples have shown traces of wax residue inside them, which sounds like fairly direct evidence. Set a candle upright in one of the holes, and the varying sizes could, in theory, accommodate different candle diameters. It's a tidy explanation. The problem is that wax residue on an object this old is notoriously hard to interpret. Wax gets into cracks and seams from all kinds of contact over centuries in the ground. And a small amount of residue doesn't automatically mean function. It's suggestive, not conclusive, and candle holders don't typically need 12 differently sized holes and a fully enclosed hollow bronze shell to do their job. Then there's the surveying and measuring theory, sometimes described as a leveling or ranging device. The idea is that you'd sight through the holes to judge distance or angle, useful for construction, land division, or military engineering, all things the Roman administrative machine cared about deeply. The problem here is standardization, or the total lack of it. No two dodecahedra share the same measurements. The hole sizes vary from object to object, with no consistent ratio anyone has been able to pin down. A measuring tool that measures differently depending on which specific copy you happen to be holding isn't a measuring tool. It's decoration that happens to look like one. A more recent and genuinely inventive theory comes from the world of knitting. In 2014, a hobbyist experimented with using a 3D printed replica to wind wool around the corner knobs, working yarn through the graduated holes to shape the fingers of a glove, with the different sized holes producing different finger widths. It's a clever demonstration, and it went viral for good reason, because it's the first theory that actually explains why you'd need multiple different sized holes on the same object. But historians were quick to point out the problem. There's no archaeological evidence for this specific knitting technique existing anywhere near the time these objects were made. No needles, no yarn, no partially finished gloves ever found alongside a dodecahedron. And the craft of knitting as we understand it doesn't show up clearly in the historical record until roughly 1,000 years later. It's a good party trick. It's a much weaker historical claim. Beyond those three, the list of proposed theories just keeps going, and it tells you how genuinely stumped people have been for centuries. Dice, for gaming or divination. Scepter or staff ornaments, signaling military or religious rank. Devices for calculating the optimal date to sow winter grain, based on how sunlight might pass through the holes at specific times of year. Tools for calibrating the diameter of water pipes, since Roman aqueduct engineering required consistent pipe sizing across huge distances. Bases for army unit standards, even a proposed use as a kind of rangefinder for artillery crews, or as a rudimentary sundial, placed at a fixed location where sunlight through two specific holes would align on a particular date, an idea some researchers have connected to why the objects cluster in the shorter, more variable, growing seasons of northern Europe rather than the Mediterranean. There's even a theory floated by amateur cryptography enthusiasts that the graduated holes could have served as a sizing gauge for wooden rods used in an ancient encryption method, letting officers convert a strip of leather or parchment into a specific rod diameter to decode field messages, with 12 sizes potentially allowing the cipher to rotate on a schedule. It's speculative and unproven like the rest, but it's one more example of just how wide open this question still is. Each of these has its defenders, and each one runs into the same wall the others do, which is that Roman written culture, so thorough about nearly everything else, simply never bothered to explain any of it. That absence is really the center of the whole mystery, and it's worth sitting with instead of rushing past it towards something more dramatic. The Romans were prolific record keepers. We have detailed Roman writing about plumbing, about military logistics, about surveying instruments, about religious festivals down to which god got which offering on which day. For an empire, this obsessed with documentation to leave zero written trace of an object requiring real skill and real expense to produce, repeated over 130 known times across multiple provinces and multiple centuries, is genuinely unusual. It doesn't automatically mean something was being hidden on purpose. Plenty of everyday objects across history go unmentioned in writing simply because everyone alive at the time already knew what they were for, and nobody thought a common household or workshop item was worth writing down. Most surviving Roman texts that come down to us were written by and for the literate elite, historians, poets, senators, and a tool used by rural craftsmen, frontier surveyors, or provincial soldiers might never have crossed the desk of anyone who wrote the kind of documents that survive today. Silence in the record isn't proof of a cover-up. It's often just proof of whose voices got preserved and whose didn't. There's also a detail that rarely makes it into any version of this story, real or invented, which is what these objects were actually found alongside. Excavation records show dodecahedra recovered from coin hoards, from burial sites, and from what look like domestic contexts, ordinary settlement debris rather than temples or shrines. That mixed pattern is itself a clue because it argues against any single tidy explanation. An object exclusively tied to religious ritual would tend to show up in religious contexts. An object exclusively used for a trade would tend to cluster around workshops. Instead, these things turn up scattered across very different types of sites, which suggests either the object had more than one purpose, depending on who owned it, or it carried a kind of value, financial, symbolic, or status-related, that made sense in more than one setting at once. That's a real pattern, drawn from real excavation data, and it's far more interesting than a manufactured story about hidden bone residue because it's actually a puzzle with no clean answer, rather than a fake puzzle with a manufactured spooky one. The frontier geography deserves one more look too, because it's easy to skip past, and it might be the single most concrete clue we actually have. These objects cluster along the edge where Roman administration met Gallic and Germanic populations, a zone where Roman engineering, Roman coinage, and Roman military infrastructure overlapped daily with local Celtic craftsmanship and local custom. That overlap zone produced plenty of hybrid material culture throughout the empire, objects and practices that were neither fully Roman nor fully local, but something blended, created by communities living between two worlds. A tool, ornament, or ritual object born out of that kind of cultural overlap wouldn't necessarily need to be written about by historians in Rome, because it may never have been common enough, or Roman enough, to register as worth, recording by the kind of writers whose work survived. That doesn't require a cover-up, it just requires a frontier culture producing something distinctly its own, at a scale small enough to fall through the gaps of a very large empire's written record. So where does the AI angle actually fit into any of this, honestly? Researchers absolutely do use computational tools, including machine learning models, to help analyze artifact geometry, run pattern, comparisons across large excavation databases, and model possible functions mathematically. Photogrammetry and 3D scanning have already let museums create detailed digital models of individual dodecahedra, the kind of precise geometric data that could genuinely feed into a computational comparison across all known examples, looking for consistent ratios between hole sizes or shared proportions that might point toward a specific function nobody has properly tested yet. That's a real and growing part of archaeology, and there's nothing wrong with a headline about AI being involved in studying an ancient object. The dishonest part is the leap from that reasonable premise to a specific, dramatic, fully formed narrative about forbidden magic and quarantined evil, complete with invented forensic details that no actual excavation report or peer-reviewed paper anywhere contains. A language model can help summarize existing theories, spot patterns in datasets, or generate hypotheses for archaeologists to test. It cannot perform physical metallurgical testing on an object it was never given physical access to, and it cannot discover forensic evidence that was never actually collected. When you see a video claiming an AI uncovered secret bone residue or determined a metal alloy recipe through analysis alone, what actually happened is a chatbot was prompted to write compelling fiction, and it succeeded because that's what it was asked to do. That distinction matters beyond just this one topic, because this exact pattern, take a real unsolved mystery, insert the phrase AI analysis revealed, and then attach a dramatic, entirely invented conclusion, has become its own content genre over the past year. It works because the setup borrows real credibility. The Roman dodecahedron actually is unexplained. Archaeologists actually are stumped. AI actually is being used in serious research contexts. Every piece of the foundation is true, right up until the moment the video tells you what the AI supposedly found, which is the one part nobody can verify because it never happened. The honest version doesn't need any of that inflation to hold your attention. Picture the actual object for a second, cast in bronze using a difficult, expensive technique, carried, buried, or lost across the coldest, most contested edge of the Roman world, from Britain down through Gaul and into Germany, over a span of roughly 200 years. Made with enough consistency and basic form that we recognize each one immediately, and yet with enough variation in size and detail that no two are quite alike. Handled by people who apparently understood exactly what to do with it, without needing a single word of instruction, in a culture that wrote almost everything else down. That's not a manufactured mystery designed to farm engagement. That's an actual gap in the historical record, sitting in museum cases across Europe right now, and after nearly 300 years of study, nobody has closed it. Maybe it really was for knitting gloves, and we just haven't found the missing evidence yet. Maybe it measured something we no longer have the context to understand. Maybe it meant something different depending on which province you found it in and who was holding it. Or maybe, and this is the possibility that never seems to get its own dramatic video, it was something ordinary enough that nobody in the ancient world thought it needed explaining at all, and the mystery says more about the limits of what survives from the past than it does about anything sinister buried underneath it. Either way, you don't need a fabricated forensic report to find that unsettling. An empire that wrote down almost everything and chose, or simply never got around, to write down this, is strange enough entirely on its own terms.